This week in 1% Weekly, Greece finally emerges from its 9-year bailout. Elite member Nick Rathel talks to us about living and working abroad, and we talk about the record take in inheritance tax. It's been a 9-year nightmare for the Greeks. In that time, they've had the biggest bailout in all recorded history, 260 billion euros from their EU partners and the International Monetary Fund. 4 successive governments since 2010 have been trying to stave off bankruptcy, but it's been a high price that they've paid. Even now, as Greece emerges from this bailout and is effectively free to borrow money on the international bond markets again, national debt stands at 180% of GDP, and the bank's balance sheets are loaded up with what are technically called non-performing loans. So in other words, Greece is still a basket case. Loads of people have been unemployed. I think unemployment has just come down from 26% to about 19%. So it's better than it was. And there's some shoots of economic recovery. They're looking at maybe 2%, 2.2% growth this year. But it's been a traumatic journey since those happy days back in 2001 when they traded in the drachma for the dreaded euro. And this political experiment that said the mighty Germany would have the same currency as Greece or Spain, absolutely bonkers from any kind of economics point of view. But as I keep saying, this is not an economic project. It's a political project. And the kind of arrogance with which the unelected leaders of Europe pursue this project has no time for the kind of human suffering that's gone on in Greece. And as you know, back in the day, they couldn't get money out of the hole in the wall. I know of situations where businesses were only allowed access to a few €100 a week. It was an absolute nightmare. So surely the lesson of this is not that it's all hunky-dory now simply because they've managed to somehow come out of the other end of the bailout. The underlying issues are still there. The euro is not going to do any favors for the Greek economy. Even now, the IMF is skeptical about the long-term situation. As recently as June this year, there had to be more debt relief from Greece's partners and easier payment terms for the outstanding loans. So yes, they're kind of easing off the thumbscrews a little bit, but who's to say that there's actually going to be a fundamental shift in the whole Greek economy that's suddenly going to turn into some kind of German powerhouse of Europe? I can't see it happening. We've got Italy with in a terrible state with its banks, France improving slightly with Macron's changes, Spain still, I think the jury's a bit out on how well Spain's going, but Greece certainly is not out of the woods yet. And surely there are lessons here for these European leaders. You cannot simply impose your will on different economies, on different countries, on different cultures. They had this kind of structure where civil servants retired at 50 on a full pension, and that's how their country ran. Now, when you've got your own currency, you can make adjustments in economic policy to cope with those kind of ideas. When you're all trying to be part of the same political union and part of the same economic union, it's much harder to do that. You've all got to play by the same rules, which means you've all got to be part of the same culture and the same kind of understanding and methods of doing business. That is so never going to happen in Greece compared to Germany. So for me, whilst it is a technical milestone that on August the 20th, Greece came out the back end of this bailout program, as far as I'm concerned, the underlying issues have not been addressed. We've put a band-aid over the symptoms and we're hoping it'll all go away and we can kick the can down the road the way that only politicians can. Mark my words, this is not the last we'll hear of major economic issues in Greece. As you know, I love to use these 1% weekly programs to share with you some of the interesting members that we've got in Elite Investor Club. Now we're starting a new series of interviews with Nick Rathel. He's somebody I've known for about 15 years in his role as a professional copywriter. But first, before we get onto his business, I wanted to talk to him about what it's been like to live and work in 3 other countries. So Nick, when I did my talk at our recent summer event, I started talking about the idea of what I called meta diversification, which was that you might want to be based in more than one country because ultimately it's all about going where we're treated best. And when we were chatting, you said that you'd actually lived and worked in a couple of other countries.
Yes.
So I thought it'd be good for our members just to hear your experience about what it was like, what made you choose those countries, how what happened when you got there, how you actually coped with a very different system. So I think we're talking about France, Spain, and America.
That's right, yes.
Okay, so let me start with a country dear to my own heart, which is France. Tell me about your experience there.
Well, altogether, I lived in France for just over 2 years in various chunks. The first time I went over there, I've been on a few day trips to Calais and Boulogne at school, but for my A-levels I actually did French. But as is usually the case with studying at school, you can barely say bonjour and au revoir. So I went over to my sister's former boyfriend the first summer of university, slept on his sofa for a week whilst I was looking for a restaurant job. Nearly ran out of money, went to about 200, and as luck would have it, and determination, I found a job in a cafe called Le Jardin de Thé, opposite the Pompidou Centre, and I worked there for 3 summers, my first, second and third year of university. A 4-year course, European Studies with History, yes, down there with Media Studies, 3 years of which were useless, but the third year was a year of study in a French business school in France, and that's the first point I want to make about succeeding abroad.
Okay, well, that you had to study business in the country.
Yes and no. The point I want to make is back then, and meant more years ago than you might think looking at me now, English wasn't as widespread as it is now. When you go abroad, a lot of people, especially younger people, want to talk to you in English. But when I went to France, it was French or nothing, which was perfect when you want to learn the language. I actually studied in a place called Besançon, which is near the Jura Mountains in eastern France, east of Dijon, near the Swiss border. And we had classes from 9 to 5, and all in French, sometimes 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., the last 2 hours being Spanish classes in French. So you really learnt fast. I had a French roommate in the block of flats we were in, and there were only 2 other English people from my university there. So point number 1, make sure you go for what's known in French as immersion totale. Don't try and avoid English speakers if you can, obviously not if you're married to one, but if you want to learn a language, do try your hardest to keep away from English sources and go native, as they used to say in days gone by.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because there is a tendency, certainly for Brits, to huddle together when they're abroad, and you get these little expat communities.
Yes.
Whereas, I've certainly found it a lot more rewarding to just get into real life with real French people and be in situations where you're forced. We have some friends in France where they hardly speak a word of English between them. So it's an ordeal for us, but I think you become a kind of a master of finding a way of saying something, even if you don't know all the vocabulary. And you get yourself understood. But what about, let's talk about, working abroad, because how would your experience in Spain have differed from your experience in France?
Well, in France, as I mentioned at the beginning, I worked in a cafe restaurant. I spoke French almost all the time, but it came in handy when the tourists, particularly the Dutch and the American tourists, were around, because you could say in English, hello, why don't you come here? And in an overseas environment where they're a bit disorientated, that worked very well. But a tip I would use when you're learning a language, you don't have to know everything overnight. You don't have to speak it perfectly, but well enough to wrap your tongue around the words properly. Because let's face it, in France, and particularly in Spain, with my blonde hair and blue eyes, I stood out a mile as a foreigner. But people will think, oh, you're a foreigner, but if you speak the language and you make an effort, they'll forgive you almost anything. And that gives you an enormous freedom that you may not have in your own country, depending on where you're from watching this. No, the social norms, you're expected to know them, whereas in France, you can use, to coin a phrase, you can make a faux pas, but it's not such a big deal as long as you learn from it.
Okay. So you spent some time in France. Tell me a bit more about your experiences when you then went to the next country south, into Spain.
Spain, again, I was at a language school there with people quite a bit younger than me, but again, hardly any English people. It was for a year in Barcelona. I did some voluntary work for the Red Cross. And I also had a language exchange known as an intercambio with a local lawyer, where we spoke a bit of the time in English and he spoke a bit of the time with me in Spanish, and a bit of Catalan as well, being a proud Catalan. And that's a good way. There are all sorts of places. In Paris, when I was there was the American church, l'Église américaine, a notice board. These days it would probably be online. But try and find local, because there will be locals, and I found this in Besançon, students who want to learn English, and you do an exchange between the two.
Okay, great. And then, of course, you left the shores of Europe, and you ended up in, I think, New York?
That's right, yes, where my Spanish came in very useful, particularly in Brooklyn when I was asking for directions in the street. And strangely enough, it was perhaps the most alien experience of the three, because even though we're supposed to be Eurosceptics, there is a common bond between us and the French, even though they call us roast beef and make fun of English cooking, ditto to an extent in Spain. But again, use your accent and the fact that you're English to your advantage, particularly in non-English speaking countries, where I did a lot of translation work for local companies, because I worked at the Cannes Tourist Board in France, and also their commercial management department with 8 French women. That's a whole other video we could talk about. But use your Englishness as a great tool, that people hold in high value and esteem across the world, that you can help their business or their children to learn English to a higher level.
It's one of the things that I'm starting to say to people now, particularly the people who perhaps got younger, adult children, is that they should be looking to some of the what are sometimes called frontier markets for business growth, or even just for a career. And certainly I'm aware of people who are going out to some of these places, could be Vietnam or Laos or wherever, and their starting point is teaching English as a foreign language, just to get a bit of cash flow.
Oh, very much so. I mean, if I could had another life and could live it again, I would certainly learn Mandarin. That would be absolutely the number one. I mean, they have a table of language. I think Chinese is first, then I think it's Arabic is next. They would possibly be the 2 languages I would learn if I had a chance again. But French and Spanish is a pretty good starting point. Of course, you've got the Maghreb countries, about half of Africa, and then Spain, of course, South America.
Okay. So in terms of your own sort of plans, are you likely to diversify outside of the UK in the near future? Do you see any other, pied-à-terre in any of these other countries appealing to you?
Oh, very much so, yes. I think, but it's nice to have the option to do it, even if you don't, because things may happen in your country. I mean, I heard last night on the news, Venezuela's interest rate is 65,000% a month. Now, okay, maybe that's not going to happen here, but we're both old enough to remember the days of wildcat strikes, 3-day weeks, rubbish piled up in the streets, which as a little boy is the searing memory I have of the end of the 1970s. So it's good to have that potential bolt hole in another country where, okay, you may not be bilingual, but you've got enough knowledge to know your way around and find a good notaire in France, or open a bank account and find work.
And I think finally, probably you've in a sense developed a perfect skill set for doing this, because you've got a business that is not location dependent.
Exactly. And whilst I may have criticised digital marketing in another sphere, it has opened up the world. You can run your business from a laptop, whether it's in Clacton, Cannes, Catalonia or wherever. It really gives you the chance to develop as a person and learn. With one final tip for language learning, which is counterintuitive: watch lots of television in these countries. It may be rubbish, but that's a tip I found that really enhanced my learning, along with mixing with local people, just having the radio or the television on all day.
Perfect. Great advice, great information as ever. Nick Raddle, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much, Graham.
So that's Nick's experience of living and working in France and Spain and in America. And if you saw my talk at the recent Summer Spectacular, you'll know that I'm really keen on us having choices of where we live, where we base our business, where we have our bank accounts and so on. I call it meta diversification, and it's a theme I'm going to be coming back to over the coming months. But I thought it was great just to share Nick's experiences of living in other countries. If you've seen any of my or Jeff Lermer's talks on inheritance tax, you'll know that it's becoming a really live issue for those of us who've managed to accumulate a few assets during our lifetime. The government has cynically kept the inheritance tax threshold at £325,000 per person for nearly a decade. As more and more properties, particularly in London and the South East, have gone up in value, that was meaning that lots and lots of ordinary folk were being drawn into the inheritance tax net, when really it was, in the old days, you'd call it death duties. It was something that was paid by the aristocracy, not by somebody living in a 3-bedroom semi in Croydon. Well, finally, we got some kind of respite from it when they introduced these new measures that allowed a gradually increasing family home transfer, if you like, of amounts that will go up to about £1 million in 2020. Now, the reality is the rules around it are breathtakingly complex. And what's been discovered is that only a few thousand estates are taking advantage of it. In the last 12 months, 24,000 families found themselves pulled into the inheritance tax web, and a record £5.2 billion was raised. That's 8% more than the year before, despite the apparent generosity of this new allowance. So what's happening is those who are taking financial advice are understanding perhaps that they could make a claim, although I believe if your estate is worth more than 2.2 million, you still can't actually make this extra claim. But many who do probate themselves aren't aware of these changes and are not claiming it. So from the figures I've seen, so far only something like 3,000 estates have claimed this additional allowance for passing on the family home to the next generation. So if you've been involved as an executor with an estate, or you know somebody who has, especially if you've done it yourself without any independent financial advice, do take a fresh look at those figures and see whether you've claimed all of the allowances that you can for transferring the family home. Now, my own opinion on this is that this is one of those taxes that should just be completely abolished and wiped out. It raises a relatively small amount compared to income tax or VAT. The rules around it are stupidly complex, and so you have this bizarre situation where people are not claiming simply because they don't understand the rules. Now, good old Spreadsheet Phil, in his latest budget, has actually asked our buddies at the Office of Tax Simplification to take a fresh look at these inheritance tax rules. Now, as I've said before, if ever anybody should voluntarily commit hara-kiri, it's a group that calls itself the Office of Tax Simplification in the United Kingdom in 2018, when we have the most complex tax code on the entire planet Earth. We have no tax simplification, we have an Office of Tax Complication. It's called 11 Downing Street, and it's been there for years, and good old George Osborne was as bad as any when it came to massively increasing the complexity of our taxes. He probably learned his skills on the knee of Gordon Brown, and who knows before that. So one after another of the occupants of number 11 Downing Street have decided to make things more and more and more complicated to the point where no one person, no one company can understand the entire tax code. So for us, inheritance tax is one of those core areas of interest. It's where we've seen the biggest difference in the proposals we've made to our clients. Please make sure that you and those you know about and care about are claiming all the reliefs they can to reduce the impact of this 40% tax on the next generation. Thanks for watching 1% Weekly. If you like what you see, why not subscribe to the channel and don't forget to click the bell so you get notified every time we broadcast a new program. Or if you just want to watch another video, how about this one? Are you going to make a choice then? Because I can't sort of stay here all day. I'm getting my hands are getting tired. So, in your own time,